Hi, it's John Taffer from Bar Rescue. Did you know the second building in America was a tavern? When I built my new restaurant franchise concept, Taffer's Tavern, I thought back to the roots of what makes a tavern, timeless character, all while delivering an unbelievably delicious food and beverage experience. That paired with my 40-plus years in the industry provides a clear roadmap to success. Do you have what it takes to be a Taffer's Tavern franchisee? If so, I'd love to hear from you. Visit franchise.tafferstavern.com.
Holidays are here, and so is fashionable fitness. Gift yourself a Samsung Galaxy Z Flip 3 5G, a phone that folds in half to literally stand on its own. Pair it with the Galaxy Watch 4 for ultimate wellness and wow factor. Check health stats, flex personal records. Over 90 activities can be tracked, like biking, swimming, golfing, and more. Invest in yourself with tech made to crush goals. Holidays open up with Galaxy. Shop it all at Samsung.com. 5G connection and availability may vary. Check with carrier. Products sold separately.
Hey everyone, this is the Almost World Podcast. Bringing to you mind-blowing interviews with guests from all over the world. So settle down, relax, and enjoy the show. Oh yeah, by the way, if you like the podcast, please support Almo's World Podcast on Patreon. Your support is what helps the podcast improve more and more. Welcome to Almo's World Podcast. This is Elmo and I'm with my awesome friend Roland. Hey man, can you introduce yourself?
Hey Elmo, thanks for having me on. I'm Roland. I'm a software engineer. I like to call myself a software engineer by day and then a philosopher and theologian by night, because it's what I do in my free time for fun. I'm a Christian. I'm a Protestant. I have a personal blog at thinkingout.com. And then I also co-lead an online ministry called Faith Seeking Understanding with a friend of mine, in which we put together 2 modules a year covering biblical, systematic, and practical theology. So you can access that at faithseekingunderstanding.co.za.
I guess you're a philosopher and theologian by night, right? And what got you there, bro? Can you tell us the story? Let's say from the start.
Okay. So I grew up in a Christian home. I grew up going to church, I think would be better. My mom was Christian, my dad wasn't. So I grew up in a Protestant church. I'm still a Protestant today. And I would say about 2009, I had a bit of a crisis of faith, which propelled me to sort of investigate Christianity from a more intellectual angle. So initially, I think I became a Christian for more like social reasons, it just felt right. And the group of people I knew were Christian and so on. But yeah, 2009 was really the day, year when I started digging into things more, largely because of the crisis of faith that I was having. So then as I started looking into both so I started looking deeper into theology, getting into like more systematic issues like doctrines of grace, divine providence, and, so on, like name your doctrine. It was interesting to me. And then from like the truth claims of Christianity, I started looking at the history side of things, because to me, my crisis of faith wasn't really about whether God existed or not. That wasn't really a huge concern of mine at the time. It was more about whether like Christianity was the way that God had revealed himself or not. And so after a bit of searching, I started on the history side, and I eventually was led to a guy called William Lane Craig and his ministry called Reasonable Faith. And that then he was talking about, defending the resurrection of Jesus and so on. But then also because he's a philosopher, I got interested in philosophical arguments for God's existence and the sort of background philosophical issues related to that, like ontology, time, metaethics, and so on. So, as I sort of continue reading, and from there, that sort of I didn't just stop at, 2009, it just was the start of a new era, really. As I continued reading and getting interested in the background issues, I started reading more and more authors as I tried to tackle different questions. And then I'd say probably the big paradigm shift in my way of thinking came in about 2013, I would say, largely because of the work of a guy called Dr. Edward Fazer and some Thomists that I spoke to online. which kind of led me to adopt initially at least, a broadly Aristotelian philosophical framework for dealing with that. I was mainly attracted by how systematic it was in terms of its ethics and the connection it made between ethics and the philosophy of nature and metaphysics, right? Which are all these were very disconnected questions for me previously. And, this Aristotelian framework was sort of bringing these all together into like a coherent system. And I really liked that. I also liked what I perceived to be the more principled method of approaching topics rather than relying on intuitions everywhere and sort of before I became an Aristotelian, it felt like a bit of a grab bag of like intuitions and arguments that didn't really it wasn't clear how they're always connected to each other and so on. I was trained I studied as mathematics and computer science, like pure maths. And so in many ways, I found the Aristotelian approach to philosophy very mathematical. Which I don't know, it just fitted well with my maths brain, I guess. And then, over time, I eventually became a Thomist, which is a particular brand of Aristotelianism. But I couldn't really tell you when that happened. It just happened gradually over the next few years. And then, since 2013, that like big moment, I've basically been translating all my various philosophical commitments that I had prior to that into this more systematic framework and then using those to explore new questions from an Aristotelian perspective. And then in parallel with that, there's been a gradual theological development as well. And I've certainly changed my views on all sorts of theological questions, but I don't really think there's been as significant a paradigm shift as there was with my Aristotelian shift in philosophy. So a big sort of area of interest to me is investigating, how to properly or how to helpfully, I guess, synthesize philosophy and theology together. And that's been a big emphasis on that faith-seeking understanding project that I mentioned.
You already started from being a believer at the start, right? And you were maybe on the edge at times, but you were always a believer.
I've definitely, it's grown. It's more of my story is more of one of a believer who's come to appreciate the intellectual basis for his faith, rather than someone who was a non-believer and then convinced of Christianity intellectually.
Okay, then when it comes to that, I get a lot of guests here also who say that they were more convinced of Christianity because of the intellectual side, right? But you seem to talk about that you would rather be more on the really rational side of things rather than the intuitional side. How do you define it? What do you mean by this intuitional basis things?
It's more like it's a good question. So I'm trying to find a good way to describe it because it's, I've never had to really articulate it before. But I guess before I sort of started approaching questions from an Aristotelian perspective, it was very much like, okay, you have a new problem space, let's say the philosophy of time, and you want to decide between one theory of time and another. So what you do in that approach is you say, okay, well, what do I find intuitive? And then let me try and ground those intuitions in something, or let me start from those intuitions and try and ground them in something or justify them or something, what arguments could I give for them? And then what do those intuitions tell me about which view of time is correct, right? Whereas from an Aristotelian perspective, it was more like, okay, out of all of reality, what is the most undeniable features of reality that we need to explain in our philosophy? And that would be change and multiplicity. The fact that things change to some degree, but also some degree stay the same. I will change myself. I don't know, I'll change my height, or my eye color will change, or my hair length will change, and so on. But then there's still me under the hood, right? So there's change and permanence together. And then there's multiplicity and unity together. So there's you and I are both distinct individuals, but there's some unity that we share by virtue of both being human, let's say, or both being on Earth or whatever. And so those are like really basic, fundamental features of reality. And so the Aristotelian is cool, well, let's make sense of those. Let's explain those. Let's analyze those. And then, so they do that in terms of actuality and potentiality and a few other categories. And then let's like try and build out from there. Let's try and get to the principles and then try build out from those principles. So when we come to time, when we come to questions of time, now we have like, okay, what is time? Time is the measure of change. Okay, we know what change is. Change is the actualization of potentials. Okay, we know all these things about actuality and potentiality and how they relate to each other. And so we can use that to like decide, or not always decide, but we can use that. We have this like broader framework that we've worked out to help us in our quest on new issues. That makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I guess you're what you mean by that Aristotelian is it's sort of mathematical, right? Like, for example, if you make a claim this, it has to follow these entailments and not contradict each other in terms of the other things that you believe. So on all parts, ontology and epistemology, you're looking at it from a broad perspective, and you actually make sense of things, and because you don't base everything or some things on purely intuitional things, so all your arguments, I guess, or all the claims that you make seem to actually work together because of the Aristotelian nature of how you approach your belief system. Am I right?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good way of saying it. Like, I think, or you might say it like, before I, was like this, I would say everything was piecemeal. So like I had an island over here, which was my philosophy of time, and I had an island over there, which was my philosophy of possible worlds. I had my island over there that was ethics. But with Aristotelianism, it's like, okay, well, let's try and build a system that is firstly based on the most fundamental features of reality, and that we can then grow out to address these different issues. And so everything is like pinned together as part of a wider system, rather than sitting by itself in these like separate islands. And I mean, in that sense, definitely, I would say maths is a pretty good example of that. Like, if you think of the history of maths, we would address, historically, we would study different fields of maths separately. Like, we would study algebra and geometry separately. Then, group theory would come on. We have our theory of group theory. But then around like the 20th century, we started developing set theory as this sort of basis from which to build all these other things from, And so now we have a kind of a more unified language, a more unified framework to understand these things in. And, we can change the framework if we want. But I think for me, the shift from what I was doing before to what I'm doing now with like an Aristotelian framework, it gave that sort of system within which to work.
To the listener here, I'm going to ask Roland to take us on an Aristotelian journey from the very fundamental basics, of what we should believe or what we can believe, or where the real starting point is, and how he arrives to becoming a Christian. So where is that starting point, my friend?
Maybe, okay, so that's quite a long journey. I mean, I can recommend you some books. I can give you some detail in the beginning, and then I can just talk you through some of the steps that you would take to get to the individual things. But going into detail for every step would take us, yeah. So I can recommend just to your listeners, Edward Fazer has a really good book called Scholastic Metaphysics, where he kind of does this in quite a lot of detail. And I would highly recommend that as a place to see how this could be worked out. I mean, his book is still just like the foundations, like the metaphysics of it, but it's a really good example of how you can do it fairly systematically and detailed while engaging with contemporary philosophy on certain issues and so on. So when the Aristotelian approaches this question, like, okay, we want to start thinking about the world systematically. We want to try and like start making sense of it. So how do we do that? Okay. And for the Aristotelian, we try to say, okay, well, what are the most undeniable features of reality, right? Like, what are the things that like almost can't not be true? I mean, maybe they could be false, right? Like maybe everything about what we understand in the world is deceiving us, but like what are the most basic sort of features of reality? And the Aristotelian sort of identifies two. The first, and those are the two that I've mentioned. So it's change and multiplicity. Okay, so Fazer makes an interesting note that, like, even if, for example, the external world doesn't exist, right? And like it's all an illusion, and you're just like this, like this Descartes thought, you're just like this disembodied mind or something, whatever. you still have to recognize that there's change and multiplicity, right? Like if you want to put forward an argument that your body doesn't exist, you have to recognize that there are premises, and those premises are similar to each other insofar as they're premises, but they're distinct insofar as they give you distinct premises. And there's a conclusion, right? So that you have multiplicity and unity there. And then change is you would go from thinking about the premises to thinking about the conclusion. So your thoughts would have changed, but you would still be the same person having thought about the entire argument. So there's change and permanence together there. So even if you denied the existence of the external world, you would still have to kind of reckon with change and multiplicity as reality. So I think that's a pretty good indicator that those are sort of the fundamental features of reality. Of course, if someone wants to come along and say they are more fundamental, there's an even more fundamental feature of reality, we would have to talk about it. But for now, we can just take those as the ones. And so the Aristotelian, Aristotle wasn't like existing in a bubble. He wasn't the first person to recognize that these were real features of reality and they were pretty basic. Philosophers before him had done that. And so the typical story that's told is, you have, if you like Parmenides or Heraclitus, and they try to make sense of reality with just one principle. They try to postulate there's one principle behind everything that we experience. For Parmenides, it was the one. So he emphasized unity and permanence, like stability. And for Heraclitus, for him, it was like flux. So he emphasized change and multiplicity. But neither of them can really make sense of the contrast of one. So like Parmenides, if there's only one thing and there's no distinction between anything, then you can never change, right? Because in order to change, you have to go from being one kind of thing to being a different kind of thing. So they have to have been like two variations on being or something. So he can make sense of oneness, but he can't make sense of multiplicity. As an example. He can make sense of stability, but he can't make sense of change. Heraclitus has the opposite problem, right? So he can make sense of change, but for him, because everything is always in flux, he can't really make sense of any kind of stability that exists from one moment to the next. And similarly, because everything is always just different to what's come before and what comes after, he can't really make sense of any sense of unity. Like everything is just different without any kind of unity. So Aristotle kind of following Plato, but building on him a bit, says, okay, well, what we should try and do is we should break up being. We shouldn't just say there's being and non-being. We should say there's two different ways of being. There's being in actuality and being in potentiality, okay? And these two things work together in order to explain multiplicity and unity. Multiplicity and change. So, so just to give the example with change, because it's a bit easier to conceptualize. Let me just say what these things are. So actuality is the way a thing actually is, right? So like I'm actually sitting down right now, we're actually having a conversation, all those sorts of things. That's kind of being in the way that we typically think about it. But then there's potentiality, which is sort of the capacity for the range of ways a thing can be, right? So I'm actually sitting down, but I'm potentially standing or running, right? We're actually talking now, but we're potentially not talking. We're potentially talking to other people and not even communicating, right? So we've got all these sorts of potentials. We've got all these sorts of actualities, and they sort of exist in us together. And if we accept these two principles, then we can make sense of change. We can say that change is the actualization of a potential. So when I change, let's say if I stand up, I am actualizing one of the potentials that exist in me, namely the potential to be standing. Similarly, when we started this conversation, we started actualizing a potential that we had before, but what wasn't actual, namely the potential for us to be communicating with each other. And so given this distinction in being between being in actuality and being in potentiality, we can make sense of the reality of change, but we can also make sense of the reality of potentiality, right? Because we can say, the reality of stability, right? Because while which potentials and which potentials are actual or not is changing in me, there's this underlying me that isn't changing throughout the entire thing. Like I am Roland, I have my identity. It's these extra features of me that are changing and not changing, but I'm staying the same in the course of everything. So there's like this fundamental actuality, you could say, underneath all of these transient actualities that is staying the same across all of my life until I die, right? And that actuality you could think maybe is the activity of my life, that thing that is spanning, it starts when I start living and it ends when I'm dead, right? And the same thing would be true of any sort of thing that exists. There's this fundamental actuality that exists across its existence. And then there's these like transient actualities that go from merely potential to actual back to merely potential as we change in different ways. So that would be, I mean, there's other categories we could introduce like form and matter and those things which are, part of the fuller picture and are kind of, I guess you could say, examples of actuality, potentiality, but I don't want to introduce too many categories and then get lost in everything, right? Does that make sense? You want to maybe come back at me on something there?
Actually, I guess like if I were to make it, some syllogisms for the audience to follow, it would be like there are two fundamental things that features of reality: change and multiplicity. And then, in order, multiplicity shows that there is both multiplicity and unity. Then change and permanence. And then, in terms of change and permanence, we can see that there has to be two kinds of being, I guess, which is being of actuality and potentiality. And then actuality shows that there is permanence, right? So it all logically follows, right? With me having some sort of a stable identity. And then form and matter.
Yeah, so form and matter, maybe I could just describe that really briefly, but form and matter kind of intersect. So actuality and potentiality are like the most general categories. And then you have specific kinds of actualities or potentialities or specific ways that they come into existence or that they relate to each other. And form and matter is just, one way that you could think about that. So matter is like some underlying substratum or some underlying thing that's indeterminate between different ways of being. So it's potentially any one of different ways of being, right? And then form is a determination of that to one of those ways of being. So, I mean, that's a very general way of saying it, but you can think like, for example, you and I, we exist in a similar way, right? Like we are both human. We both have the human form, right? Well, that's a particular kind of form, but I guess whereas...
Would you say it's a form is sort of an abstract kind of being?
I guess I would say it's the thing that makes a parcel of matter what it is, right? So a tree is a tree because its matter is informed by the form of tree, the form of treeness, right? And then we are humans because the same underlying matter is informed by the human form, the human substance. So when we think about forms in isolation from individual beings, then we abstract them away. But when forms exist in things, when you and I, like you have your own humanness and I have my own humanness, like the forms are inside of us. Well, that's what the Aristotelian says. That's where one of the big things that the Aristotelians disagree with the Platonists with is that we would say that forms exist in things, in the things that instantiate them. And so when you consider humanness just in the abstract, what you're actually doing is you're not considering like a form, you're considering like a form. It's just a concept in your head that you've abstracted away from individual humans. So just to like close it off with the actuality and potentiality. So matter has all sorts of potentialities, and those potentialities are actualized by particular forms. And so that's like a sort of a particular way that actuality and potentiality can come into existence. But there's other ways as well. So it can be very general and generic, but it's that's how it can unify a whole bunch of different things. But I'll stop talking now and you can ask a question.
Then you've proven from an Aristotelian way that there are these things, right? Multiplicity, unity, change, permanence, actuality, potentiality, form, and matter. What then? Like where after that, where are we going?
Yeah. So I think what you want to do, in general, the Aristotelian starts with what's most obvious to them, tries to move backwards behind the principles, right? So there's things that you see, and there are these mixtures of things. Like you and I are mixtures of form and matter, right? We're mixtures of actuality and potentiality. And then you want to like sort of get behind these mixtures to the things that are being mixed together. And that's what we're doing when we're distinguishing potentiality, actuality, form, matter, substance, accident, all the different categories that Aristotelians like to talk about. And so the first thing, there's different things you could do at this point. Like if you just want to broaden your system, now you've got these categories, actuality and potentiality. You understand them in terms of the things that they explain fundamentally, namely change and permanence, and multiplicity and unity. So now you can go figure out like, okay, how do I analyze all these different things in reality in terms of form and matter, in terms of act and potency, in terms of all these different things, right? And that helps you understand more broadly what's going on. You know what I mean? So you can, for instance, we said change, but you could analyze causation. You could say, well, what's causation? Like when one thing causes another thing, what's happening, right? And so there, the Aristotelian would say, okay, well, what's happening is there's a potential. Something has a potential to be in a particular way, and something else, the cause, we call it, is actual in a way that can actualize that potential. So, for example, a pan can get hot. It's not hot right now. It's cold. It's sitting, in the cupboard, or it's room temperature, let's say. But it has the potential, like the way that it's made up, it has the potential to become hot, right? It can exist in a certain range of temperatures without exploding. Or I don't know what would it do? I guess it would melt if it got really hot. And so now I can say, okay, well, how would that pan, like when the fire causes the pan to get hot, what's happening? Oh, well, there's an actuality in the fire, and that actuality, namely its heat, its motion, that's constituting the heat, that is actualizing the corresponding potential in the pan, right? And so to become hot. And so there we're seeing that causation is just the actualization of a potential. And so now we're starting to understand this a bit more, right? So now we've like attached the notion of causation onto this system that we're slowly but surely building out. Even when we spoke about form and matter, that was another thing that we spoke about, where we were saying, okay, well, how does actuality and potentiality like work in the existence of material things? And there we isolate the substratum, which we call matter, and the thing that's determining that substratum to be in a certain way, which we call form. So there we're saying, okay, well, let's take actuality and potentiality and understand it in a particular subclass of things, namely the existence of material things. We could go further. We could say, we could even take the form matter distinction and apply it to action theory. So let me give you an example of that. I said the general idea of form and matter is that matter is this otherwise indeterminate substratum, right? So it's something underneath something, this underlying thing that can be in different ways, right? And then form is what makes it to be one of those different ways that it's indeterminate between. So imagine my motion. Imagine a particular action that I might do. Imagine, or let's not say mine, because I don't want to say that I'm punching someone. But imagine there's Alice and there's Bob, right? And Alice's hand moves into Bob's face really quickly, right? You might say, okay, well, what's Alice doing? Is she punching Bob? Is she reaching for something near Bob clumsily and then hitting his face by mistake? Or is she doing something else, right? We can now, we've identified something that is of itself indeterminate, and then we can ask what determines it to those different things. So for example, we've identified the motion of Alice's hand into Bob's face. That's the indeterminate thing. That's the matter of the action. And so what is the thing that determines whether that motion is an act of violence with Alice punching Bob, or it's an accident where Alice is, by mistake hitting Bob while clumsily going for something? Well, presumably it would be her intention, right? Her intention is what determines what she's doing, namely punching Bob or fetching something or whatever. And so now we took this theory that we had about actuality and potentiality in material things, and now we've applied it to actions in the case of the actions of material beings, right? Where there's an underlying motion, which we call the matter, and the overarching intention, which determines that matter to be the action that it is. So now we have a window into action theory, right? So we've got a window into philosophy of nature through the form and matter thing. We've got a window into action theory. We've got a window into metaphysics of causation through the act potency distinction, and so on. Like we can keep, branching out into different areas. We're kind of like pushing the boundaries out as we have this general account of things, and we try and attach these different question areas to it, right? And we try and as we do that, we expand and nuance our understanding of actuality, potentiality, any of the other categories that we then go on to talk about.
Okay, so in terms of intention, I guess it might look as if there is at least an intention that determines the actuality of a certain potentiality, right? Like for example, Alice punching Bob's face, right? So, what would you say would be the nature of this intention? Because if you ask someone, maybe a naturalist determinist, he would say, oh, that intention is simply a product of psychological and biological material in Alice's brain that causes her to do that. So there's not, and so it doesn't really matter, if it has form or anything. It's just determined to be that way in terms of natural causation.
It depends what angle you're asking it from. So if you're asking from from the context of a debate of free will versus determinism, then that's one thing. If you're asking from an action theory perspective, like it might not matter whether determinism or indeterminism is true. It's just we're interested to know like what is an action, regardless of whether it's deterministic or not. Do you see what I'm saying? So it depends. Like, are you asking from the debate on determinism or non-determinism, or on the debate from action theory? Because those are quite different directions.
I would say the action theory first, but I would also like to touch on because if it opens up a window towards free will and determinism, then where does it lead you? Or
I don't think it would. I think it would say like, so that they're the person who's bringing in like a broader theory. So we'd have to explore that broader framework to understand like why they've denied the existence of non-determinism. But the question that you would have to ask is like, okay, well, does the broader theory deny the existence of intention? Like, does intention not exist? Or are they saying, no, intention does exist. It's just understood entirely in terms of physical processes that are happening in the brain. If they say that second case, then, by all means, we'll say from the action theory perspective, be like, cool, that's good enough. As long as you have a place for intention seems to be the thing that is what determines the motion to become a particular kind of action. If their broader theory doesn't, have space for intention in it, then we'd have to ask them, okay, so what is it that makes the difference between Alice punching someone and Alice accidentally hitting them when the underlying motion is the same? And maybe they'll say nothing makes the difference. There is no difference. They're actually just the same thing. Then you're going in a particular direction. That seems pretty counterintuitive. I know there's the word intuition. You have to start, but maybe they have some good arguments, but you have to kind of ask like, which is more obvious, or which is more manifest, whatever premises that they use in an argument to deny intention, or the fact that intention seems to exist in actions and determine what those actions are. That's sort of the question you'd have to ask there and the debate you'd have to have.
Okay, cool. So now that this Aristotelian method has led to these several branches, right? The metaphysics of causation, intention, act, and potency. So where are we now, and where do we go from here?
Well, it depends where you want to go, right? So like there will be Aristotelians who spend their entire life only working in metaphysics, and that's what they'll do. There'll be Aristotelians who spend their entire life working in ethics or the philosophy of nature or the philosophy of time. And that's fine. That's what they want to do, It's the point is that it's a broader system with which we can all work. And it's similar in mathematics, right? There'll be mathematicians who spend their entire life studying category theory or topology or algebraic geometry or whatever. And that's fine. They're all using this common system and they're working on it in general. And there's an opportunity, because everything is framed in terms of these general principles that are common, like act and potency, form of matter, substance and accident. There's an opportunity to share information across those different boundaries if people are so interested, right? So if I learn something key about form of matter when studying, the existence of material things, maybe that helps me in my action theory, because I've got now this common framework of form of matter to understand both of them in terms of, but it really depends, like, what questions you want to do, what questions you want to go. But I guess what you're asking is, what's the next step if what I'm trying to do is get to Christian theism, right? So I guess you'd want to launch into an argument for God's existence. This is where you'd probably go. If you want to give an entirely rational basis. I don't think we need an entirely rational basis to believe to be rational. I don't think we need an entire like philosophical argument to be rational in our belief of Christianity. But let's say we do want to do that. Let's say we do want to build up a philosophical theology, sort of from the ground up. Then I would say the next thing you want to do is argue to the conclusion of God's existence. And here you want to find an argument that produces a rich enough conception of God for you to like base a philosophical theology on top of it. Does that make sense? So there's some arguments of God's existence that are they don't arrive at something strong enough, I guess, to get much out. Like you could say something like God exists, but that's pretty much all you could say. You couldn't argue, you couldn't like conclude to things about providence or give a systematic treatment of the Trinity if that's what you think is true and things like that. So you definitely want, I think you definitely, ideally, I mean, if you can't get it, then by all means, like, go with the best you have. But you want to find the best, not the best argument, but you want to find an argument that gives you a robust enough conception of God such that you can draw out, enough consequences of that so that you can actually reason about this God a bit. And so there's a few different cases that I think, a few different options on offer, and different people will be convinced by different arguments and so on. There's Aquinas' famously 5 ways that argue for God's existence, and they depend on varying degrees of how much of that broader system, the details you've worked out, right? So some of them depend on you having worked out like a theory of participation and the transcendentals and so on. That would be like his 4th way requires like, that, and that's quite a long way down the path, right? Other ones just require that you have a theory of act and potency and so on, right? So it depends which one you're going with there. There's also, Edward Fraser has a book out. I haven't spent much time studying it, but he's got a book out, 5 Proofs for the Existence of God, where he goes through not Aquinas' 5 ways, but he gives like a Leibnizian argument, a Augustinian argument, a whole bunch of different, I can't even remember all of them. I suspect some forms of the Leibnizian cosmological argument could probably be strong enough to build a robust theology on. Maybe an ontological argument if you can find one that you find convincing, those tend to give you quite a robust, quite a good, I guess, idea of God. Although, yeah, that can be questioned, I guess. But yeah, so there you want to defend one of these arguments, and they'll all take a different form and require different premises to defend. But for example, all of Aquinas' arguments, they will conclude to a being that is what we can say is pure actuality. So I said earlier that you and I, we exist as a mixture of potentiality and actuality, right? Like at any given moment, we have potentials and we have actualities in us. And those potentials are what allow us to change, right? Like they're these things that allow us to change. So the key idea with Aquinas' arguments and some of the other arguments that Fraser argues from, actually, I think all the arguments that Fraser presents in his book is that you arrive at a God who is maybe the first cause, but most importantly, a being of pure actuality. That is a being who exists, who is actual and in no way potential, has no potentials in them. And from that, you can draw out quite a few different things. But I mean, just to give you some examples, you could argue that this being must be immaterial, right? Because we said that matter involves having all these various potentials. And since this being has no potentials, it can't have any matter. This being is unchangeable because, as we said, change is the actualization of a potential. And since this being has no potentials, it can't change. And if we take, if we understand time as the measure of change, then we would have to say that this being, well, we'd have to be more careful, but we could argue that this being is outside of time, which is a pretty hectic thing to conclude. So we could keep arguing for these different principles, and that's sort of what you see, for example, in Aquinas's large, like huge work called Summa Theologia, where it's like hundreds and hundreds of questions and articles where he like addresses these different issues, right? And he gets to like God's existence in the 2nd question or something like that. And then he's got like another 50 questions after that, which deal with how do we derive each of the attributes that we typically attribute to God.
So I guess, so looking at all these arguments for God, would you say then that okay, maybe they do indicate that all at once that God could be ontologically real, right? But does it that, and as you said, doesn't really get you to the Trinity or providence or any of that those theological discussions yet. But would you say then that with those
Yeah, I think it could get you to providence, but I don't think it could get you to. I'm of the opinion it can't get you to the Trinity, but I think it could get you to providence.
Yeah, but I guess like my question was does it then I guess get you to say that I could rationally arrive to say with these arguments to say that God does exist, or is it simply saying that okay, based on some principle of sufficient reason, I'm not really 100% certain that God is real, but because of these arguments, it gives me more confidence to say so.
Oh, okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah, so I would say the arguments that I'm talking about are deductive in form. So they would conclude, you would be as confident in God's existence as you are in the premises for the argument, right? I'm not a huge fan of. Yeah, I don't know if I would go so far as to say it's that you'd be certain in it, and the reason for that is, the way that we typically use the word certainty today, at least in popular usage, is we say we're 100% convinced that it's true, right? And I don't really think that's true of anything we believe. You know what I mean? Like or maybe some things, maybe like that we exist or something. But yeah, I mean, if I think of most things that I believe, like the external world, or that you exist, or that it's wrong to like murder people or something, I don't know. Most of those things I don't really know for certainty, right? Like I'm pretty confident. Like I'm more confident than I'm in the negation, right? I have, but I'm not like, I wouldn't say I'm certain of them. And so you see the path that we've taken here is we said, okay, well, let's start with like what's most obvious, but we haven't said, let's start with what we're certain of. Let's just say, start with what we're most obvious. So change and multiplicity. Let's get some principles. So we think that the Aristotelian picture principles does the best explanation of the phenomenon that we consider most fundamental. And then we kind of draw out the implications of that and we get to God's existence. So I can only be as certain of God's existence as I am of, the original phenomenon that he used to start the entire process with. And I don't think I was 100% certain of that. So, I don't think you're going to get to 100% certainty. But if you're asking about the form of the arguments, yeah, the form of these arguments that I'm thinking of are not probabilistic. They're deductive. Yeah.
So in that sense, if someone asks you, bro, so why do you believe in God if you're not really certain that these arguments actually, really correspond to reality? They may be deductively sound in form, right? But why do you believe?
What does that? That's like asking, why do I believe that the material world around me exists? If I can't be 100% certain that it does. It's like, well, I believe that it exists because I don't have any argument with premises that I find more convincing than what my senses are telling me. So, it's not like the mere presence of skeptical questions isn't a good reason to abandon your position, right? You need a good argument for the contrary. That's when you're weighing up the different arguments. Do you see what I mean? This is something that like, I think it's called the Moorian shift in contemporary philosophy, where it's like, any argument to the conclusion that the material world around me doesn't exist will be based on premises that I find less convincing than what my senses are showing me, namely that a material world exists. I mean, maybe that's not always true, but I have yet to find an argument with premises that are more convincing. So I go where the evidence leads.
Mm-hmm. So what I'm curious though, I do sort of understand, but like I'm curious though, right? So you're saying that your default position is that you believe in God, and so you're not really gonna.
No, I wouldn't say that. I'm just saying that I would say like, once you've worked out the Aristotelian picture and you've like run through the arguments and so on, then you can see like, okay, well, a certain count of change with a bunch of plausible premises leads to the conclusion that God exists. So that seems like, and I have no, I'm more convinced of those premises than I am of their negations, or I find that entire picture more plausible than its negation. So what's reasonable for me to do is conclude that God exists. If someone comes along and says, no, well, this piece in your argument or whatever it's not actually that plausible, or like here's a more plausible version that doesn't imply God's existence or undermines that argument for God's existence, then I would, have to question it. But, I have yet to find one.
I see. So that's awesome. So you're saying like, okay, so in order for you to prove to me that God isn't real, you have to take away my premises, which are actually like establishing the two fundamental features of reality, which is change and multiplicity, right? It's that. Yeah, like everything. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, to be clear, it's more than that, right? Like it's the premises are all built on top of that, so there will be additional premises in there. But yeah, exactly. Like you either need to undermine the reason I have for believing that he exists, in which case that argument won't work. I might still believe in God, but that might be for a different reason. But let's say you do that for for everything, whatever. Or you need to give an argument that God doesn't exist based on premises that are more plausible than the premises I used to conclude that God did exist. Right. Otherwise, otherwise, for me, the most rational thing to do is go where the evidence seems to point, right? Which is to believe that God exists.
Yeah. By the way, though, I don't know if I forgot about it, but it seems I don't think that you really got to from changed and multiplicity to God's existence. You sort of
No, I didn't. I just said there are different arguments that would go from different things. Yeah. So you're right. I didn't give the argument. I guess if I could outline the argument, but I mean, we could go back and forth about this forever. But like, I mean, we could have what I mean is we could have an entire episode just talking about, one premise of.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's say that the Aristotelian argument, does lead from change in multiplicity to God's existing. Okay, so let's say that you do have these rationalistic arguments for God, right? And you do believe him because of the premises, and no one actually making any valid argument against it. So let's say, how do you arrive at Christianity then? I'm curious.
So we got to say, I think we should say at the outset that from just philosophy, so from just observation of the world and reasoning about that rationally, even in the best case, I don't think we're going to get to Christianity. We're going to get to some sort of general theism, because Christianity is predicated on not on general features of the world, but particular actions in history, namely that God has revealed himself in the person of Jesus Christ.
So basically what you're saying is that you're a Christian because of the historical reliability of the Bible and Christ's resurrection.
Yeah, I would say, yeah, if you want to bridge the rational gap from, where philosophy to as far as philosophy can get you, or as far as like inquiry into the natural world can get you to Christianity, you would need to then go look at those things. Yeah, exactly. Okay,
then would it be fair to say that so far no one has proven to you that Christ's resurrection is false, therefore you believe that Christ did exist and did die and was buried for 3 days and was resurrected?
Yeah, so you gotta so when you approach history, you gotta ask like, okay, is the way that we approach history the exact way that we approach like metaphysics and so on? And I think it's pretty similar. Like, I think most human knowledge is at least starts off with something like inference to the best explanation. I think that's sort of what we were doing with change in multiplicity. We're saying, okay, well, our best account of this is the Aristotelian account, therefore we believe that that's true, whatever. So in the case of history, you would do the same thing. You'd have to look at what do the documents say around the time, and like what is the best explanation for the historical facts that we can draw from those documents about the historicity of the New Testament documents themselves, or just the historicity of the key events that they purport happened, that they claim happened, right? So in that case, it would be, Jesus' life, ministry, and resurrection. And that it would be a form of like inference to the best explanation. So it's...
inference to the best explanation. Okay. So in this case then, right, I'm curious because did you actually look into every detail of Christ's resurrection and the Bible's textual criticism and all of that to actually prove to yourself that Christ did and that the Bible is reliable and the account of Christ's life is actually the best inference the inference to the best explanation?
Did I look at everything? No, I haven't lived long enough to look at everything, but I guess what I've looked at a good amount, I think, enough at least to convince me, and then, or to convince me that it seems like the more reasonable option. And I think it's about saying, at any given point, what can I say with some degree of confidence, and then being open to new evidence or new arguments, and then trying to fit them into a broader picture. So, if tomorrow someone comes with we discover, and I think that's necessary, particularly with history, because, we only ever have like a certain set of documents, a certain subset of the documents that existed, that were written at the time, right? So we always only have a partial picture. So it's like, okay, well, what's the most reasonable position based on our partial picture, even if we knew everything about that picture, which like no one really does. What's the most reasonable position for us to take? And then, but we have to be open to the fact that like another part of that picture will be discovered or be revealed tomorrow. And then we have to be willing to revise our understanding of things, right? And that's just basically that's it. So I've looked at, as I said, over the years, I've looked at, initially it was the history side of things that I said. And then over the years, I've, encountered other arguments around the historicity of this or that thing, or arguments or counter arguments and so on. And so I wouldn't say I'm not really a historian. I would say I'm more of a philosopher and theologian in terms of what I actively research all the time. But like, I think I have a healthy appreciation for the history, although maybe I wouldn't be able to recite it offhand. I'd have to go find the books that I read stuff in and get answers. But yeah, so I mean, I've looked at a decent amount of stuff to be fairly confident that, I think I think the evidence points to Jesus rising from the dead and the truth of Christianity. But like, if tomorrow someone comes with a really good argument and I'm convinced by it, then, I think the responsible thing for me to do is change my mind. That's really all we can be, right? Is open to new evidence. And that's true in philosophy, science, history, whatever you believe about the world. You should try to be open, as open as you can.
So I guess then what took you to believe in God and Christianity is basically the rational arguments and just looking at it from an honest perspective and drawing the proper conclusion that you found, right?
Doing my best to look at things honestly and do my best to try and draw the best conclusions. I mean, I should say, like, when it comes to the question of like, how can we know the truth claims of Christianity or God exists? Like, I don't think the only way for a Christian to be rational, or anyone really to be rational, is to have worked through all the arguments for all the nuanced categories and arguments and all that kind of stuff. Because I don't know, like it's a very small percentage of people actually do that for anything. And so if we made that the bar for which anyone could be considered rational for any position, I feel like we'd have to say like 99% of the history people in history are like completely irrational, which seems like a bit of an extreme position to take, So in general, I would say like I'm fairly convinced as a Christian, because I'm convinced of the truth of the Christian worldview and of a particular articulation of the work of the Holy Spirit. I would say I'm fairly happy with saying, like, for example, in Christianity, that a Christian can be rational on the basis of the internal witness of the Holy Spirit. Now, obviously, that depends on the Holy Spirit being a real person and working in a particular way. So this is sort of a kind of position that you see, I think, espoused by William Lane Craig or Alvin Plantinga, or in general in a category called religious epistemology. I don't think I would go so far as they do sometimes, where they say that it's what's called an intrinsic defeater. I don't know if I would go that far, but I do think the inner workings of the Holy Spirit is one way that you can have like a rational belief in Christianity, even without knowing. It's like almost through direct experience of God rather than through argumentation. I don't think we should turn that into an argument. I think that's worth knowing. It's like there's a difference between knowing God exists through an experience of God and knowing God exists based on an argument from a religious experience. You know what I mean? The one is a rational argument. The other one is like the one is known rationally. The other one is known. The one is known. What can I say? Like through argument, and the other one is known through direct patent.
To prove it to yourself, but it's not enough to prove it to others.
Exactly. Yeah. If you want to convince others, that's not going to work. Yeah. That's a good way of saying it. Yeah. And I think there's other sources of rationality beyond that, like tradition. Like if you think of like your science class in high school, right? You were taught a whole bunch of stuff about physics that like you have never read the original sources for, you've never done the derivations of, you've never done any of that stuff, never mind chemistry or mathematical results and so on. Like, I mean, I was doing integration for my last year of high school, and I only like rarely proved integration in like measure theory in like my fourth year of maths. Do you know what I mean? But does that mean I was irrational in believing that integration was a valid thing this whole time? No, there's like a tradition of teaching and an embodiment, a cultural or social embodiment of knowledge that gets passed down from one person to the next. And like it's fallible like any piece of human knowledge, but I do think it's enough in many cases to make the beliefs of the pupils rational without them having to have gone through every single detail of the individual arguments or derive everything from first principles. So I think there's sources of rationality or rational belief outside of rigorous philosophical argumentation, even though I think what you ultimately want to do is you want to try and give rigorous philosophical argumentation for as much as you can, if that's what you're interested in, right? Like that's the ideal in some sense. Like you want to push that as far as you can, and then only avert to the other forms of knowledge if you have to, kind of thing. I mean, if that's the sort of thing that you're interested in. If you're not interested in philosophy at all, then
awesome. Yeah, and I guess like I sort of picked your brain on the philosopher part of you, but maybe it will take another episode for the theologian one because we're over an hour now. But I guess I want to ask you a couple questions in terms of in terms of what you believe is generally from a Christian perspective, why we are here, how are we supposed to act as individuals in a Christian reality. So how would you look at it, man?
Wow, that is such a easy to ask question. Yeah, and so much to unpack. So why are we here and how should we act? Those are the questions. Wow. I guess, okay, so I think as Christians, the how we should act answer, we can't understate how important our identity I should probably ask, are you a Christian? Okay, I want to know whether to speak in terms of us or in terms of me, and I don't want to presume and then it not be the case. So so I think the way that like as Christians like we should think about how to live is we should really reckon with I should reckon with two things, okay, and one we have in common with the rest of the world and one we don't. So let me start with the one that we have in common with the rest of the world. And that's just general ethics, right? So we have natures, we're human, we have a human nature, and we exist in a certain way, and that human nature flourishes under certain conditions and doesn't flourish under other conditions, right? We can go against that nature. And so God has, in some sense, like built into us as a creator, he's built into us like conditions that are good for us and conditions that are not good for us. And it's worth us pursuing what's truly good and avoiding what's evil or bad. And I think that's true of everyone. So there you kind of want to argue, I would subscribe to like a natural law theory of some kind, where you can kind of explore our human nature and what's good and what's bad and how to structure our life in terms of that. Although that can obviously get quite in the weed. It can get quite deep in a bunch of stuff. But you can talk about virtues. You can talk about how to make decisions. You can talk about all those sorts of things. To what extent you can cooperate with evil. All of these things can be philosophically investigated. But then in terms of sort of Christianity, in terms of the theological angle of it, I think, and this is unique to Christians, we have to reckon with the fact that our life and our identity is found in Christ. So that's a big shift that you see in the New Testament, is that the coming of the Messiah ushered in like a new age where we now live in this now not yet era. There's like an overlapping of two ages. There was the age that was before, and there's the age that's to come in the new creation. And we kind of sit in the middle of these two ages, like they kind of in the overlap, where we have some of our parts have been renewed in accordance with what will be one day. Like we have the Holy Spirit living in us. He is like, pushing us to grow and develop, although we can always fight against that, as I'm sure, the life of many Christians who are, not really reflecting Christ shows. But then at the same time, there's a part of us that's still tied to the old era, the era of Adam, I guess you could say. And there's a sort of internal tension, but we live in that middle era, the now not yet, we could call, or the now not yet. We live in that because we live in Christ, because Christ's Spirit lives in us and works in us to change and live. And we can only enter into that state because of what Christ has done, because he who is the greatest above all, made himself nothing, so that we could be saved and have life with God. A life better than the life that we originally meant to have in the original creation. So that has to fundamentally change the way you see the world, right? It has to change the way you understand hierarchies. It has to change the way that you understand success, how you understand humility and the value of humility in leadership. It has to impact a whole bunch of stuff. Just to give one example, this is what Jesus draws out and say the Sermon on the Mount. He says, I forgive because I've been forgiven. There's like a certain sort of existential power that we have, knowing this incredible and like almost infinite amount of forgiveness had to be bestowed upon us, that we have to then show others, we have to reflect into others, because we understand the value of it. Yeah. So that would be like a sketch. That would be like how I would think about it in terms of philosophy and theology and where you'd have to start, I guess, trying to unpack how to think about life. And once you understand how you think about life, how you see your place in the world, you can start to ask, like, okay, so how then should I act or live?
That was the awesome answer, man. And I really hope that you would succeed someday and be more famous than William Lane Craig. But
that's a pretty hard bar to reach.
But and thank you so much, bro, for coming on the podcast. You've been a great, awesome guest, and I hope the questions that I've asked you were substantial. and and thank you so much. I really appreciate it, man. And I hope you can come on our next episode someday. Maybe and talk about the theology part. Yeah,
totally. I'd be happy to come on again and chat about things. Yeah, it's been a great discussion. So thanks for having me. It's been good to it's always good to discuss these things and figure out how to articulate, what you believe and why you believe it. So thanks for having me.
So that's the end of it. Thanks for tuning in, guys. This is your host, Elmo Ador Jr. And thank you for listening in. And please subscribe. Please follow us on Facebook. Please follow this. Please. Thanks.
Gearheads know that some projects need so many parts, it feels like you need a whole storage unit just to store them. That's what eBay Motors' 122 million parts are for. Think of it as your virtual parts garage. They've always got the right fitment at the right prices. Use the eBay Motors app or visit ebaymotors.com. Let's ride.
Holidays are here, and so is fashionable fitness. Gift yourself a Samsung Galaxy Z Flip 3 5G, a phone that folds in half to literally stand on its own. Pair it with the Galaxy Watch 4 for ultimate wellness and wow factor. Check health stats, flex personal records. Over 90 activities can be tracked, like biking, swimming, golfing, and more. Invest in yourself with tech made to crush goals. Holidays open up with Galaxy. Shop it all at Samsung.com. 5G connection and availability may vary. Check with carrier. Products sold separately.